not set? Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Rice University. Welcome to Scientia and to our special annual colloquium, the Bachner Lecture. I'm Jim Pomerantz, Professor of Psychology and Director of Scientia, which is Rice's Institute for the History of Science and Culture. The Bachner Lecture is the premier lecture of the year for Scientia, and so together with the members and the fellows of Scientia, I thank you for being with us here tonight. I'm pleased to say that we have a speaker here this evening, and I think some of you already know who he is, who's distinguished both inside and outside of academia, and who's also a good friend to many of us in the room. So it'll be my pleasure to introduce George Rupp in just a moment. But for now, let me note that the Bachner Lecture celebrates the career of the distinguished mathematician and historian of science, Solomon Bachner, who was a professor of mathematics at Rice University from 1968 until his death in 1982. Before that, Bachner spent 35 years on the faculty at Princeton, and he was a member of the National Academy of Sciences and was a major intellectual force on that campus as well as on the Rice campus, where his public lectures, and in particular his assessment of Einstein on Einstein's 100th birthday, were intellectual occasions of great note. Those occasions ultimately led to the foundation of our organization, Scientia, which serves as the focal point at Rice for those interested in the history of science. At Scientia, we oversee the DeLange conferences, and we sponsor lectures that try to bridge disciplinary boundaries and remind us of the unity of knowledge and the common concerns that unite humanists with scientists. The Bachner Lecture Series, in which we're participating tonight, began in 1983. So for those of you who are doing the math, this is the 22nd anniversary of the Bachner Lecture. We've more than reached the age of maturity, so it's important that we take a moment to remember Professor Bachner for inspiring us, and also thank the many Rice faithful over the years, people like Franz Bratson, people like Al Van Helden, people like Susan McIntosh, whose efforts over the years have made Scientia the prize that it is today. Bachner lectures have been nothing if not memorable. In recent years, we've gotten to hear from a number of speakers, including C. Everett Koop, the former Surgeon General of the United States, Henry Rosofsky of Harvard, the now Nobel laureate Danny Kahneman, and last year, Professor Lee Silver from Princeton. This year, our Bachner Lecture fits in well with that tradition because we get to hear from a speaker who's had a large impact in many different areas, as a scholar, as an academic leader, and as a person who's involved himself directly over the years in studying the pressing problems of humanity, not only the kind that we study in academia, but the more immediate and gripping type that affect the world's less fortunate, those for whom daily survival is not a sure thing. As you may know, Scientia selects a different theme each year, and this year's theme is entitled Conflict, Violence, and War. That theme is selected by a group of faculty that were led this year by Professor David Queller of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Rice. And you can learn more about our theme for this year, which is now concluding, but if you check out our website, you can see what it is that we will have in store for you very soon, I hope, for the coming fall semester. So with your indulgence, let me just make one note on the format. George Rupp will speak for 50 minutes or so, we'll see. That will be followed by equally unpredictable number of minutes for questions and answers, so please be thinking of your questions for Dr. Rupp as the talk progresses. We have microphones here and explain the procedure later on, but for those of you who attend Scientia events, you know the drill. And so now for the reason why we're here tonight, namely for our speaker, George Rupp. Actually, there are two reasons why we're here tonight. One of them is George, but the other is Nancy. Nancy, we're delighted that you're here with us this evening, and it's been an opportunity for a number of us to look back and remember the 8 years that you were with us and everything that you've done to make our campus better than it was when you found it. As to George Rupp, I'm a little torn about how to introduce him because he's so well known to so many of us in the room, but I know that there are people in the room, including students, who did not overlap with George during his presidency here, and so let me err on the side of perhaps saying more than the rest of you would need to know. George currently is the president of the International Rescue Committee. It's a position he assumed about 3 years ago, and the IRC is a world leader in providing relief, rehabilitation, protection, post-conflict development, resettlement services, and advocacy for people around the globe who are affected by violent conflict and oppression. And I believe that George is going to be telling us a lot more about the good work of the IRC in the course of his comments this evening. So I won't talk further about it, except to say that if you don't understand now, I think you will understand why he was our choice to give the Bachner Lecture in this year, where our theme is war, conflict, and violence. For the 9 years before he joined the IRC, George was president of Columbia University. And at Columbia, he focused on enhancing undergraduate education, on strengthening the relationship of the campus to its surrounding communities, and in particular on increasing the university's international orientation. He completed a financial restructuring of the university and a $2.8 billion fundraising campaign that achieved 8 successive annual records in dollars raised at Columbia. Before Columbia, from 1985 to 1993, we were fortunate to have Dr. Rupp as the president of Rice University, where in the course of his 8 years, as many of us who were here during that period well know, the applications for admissions almost tripled, federal research support more than doubled, the value of the Rice Endowment increased by more than $500 million to $1.25 billion. His tenure saw the construction of Alice Pratt Brown Hall for the music school, George R. Brown Hall, Herring Hall. It saw the G7 Economic Summit in 1990. It saw the appointments of Neil Lane as provost and a set of deans. Actually, the correct term, Mary McIntyre tells me, is a density of deans. That included the aforementioned Mary McIntyre, but also Michael Hammond and Jim Kinsey, Mike Carroll, Ben Baylor, Lars Larup, and someone else whose name I can't remember. George and Nancy Rupp had a strong and positive effect on Rice, transforming it from a respected regional to a truly national institution and lifting the sights of those of us on campus up to the horizon before us. His time at Rice was energizing and affirming, not simply by showing us what in principle could happen, but by leadership through example, persuading us that it could happen. And for that, so many of us are grateful and have such fond and even exhilarating memories of those years. Before coming to Rice, George had a life. He was, among other things, the Dean of the Divinity School at Harvard University and also the John Lord O'Brien Professor of Divinity, and held a number of other important positions that you can read about on the web. He received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University in 1964, a divinity degree from Yale Divinity School in 1967, and his PhD from Harvard in 1972. He's the author of numerous articles in 4 books, including Beyond Existentialism and Zen, Religion in a Pluralistic World, and Commitment and Community. His work at the IRC takes him far and wide these days. While many, probably most of us, like to stay in our safe and familiar, comfortable surrounds, it seems that George and his partner Nancy are always hopping off to some place on the globe where our travel agents or perhaps even the State Department advises us not to go. But off he's gone, off both of them is gone, so we're doubly fortunate to have George back with us here at Rice to speak with us tonight. So without further ado, let me as usual ask you to turn off your cell phones, pagers, or anything else that makes noise, and tune in to George Rupp, whose title tonight is Local Conflicts, Global Challenge. George Rupp.
Thank you, Jim, for that gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be here. It's great to be back on campus. It's wonderful to be in Charles and Ann Duncan Hall with Charles and Ann Duncan here in person. Nancy and I are always delighted to have a chance to come back to Rice. We feel the the powerful attraction of wonderful institution and great friends. And so I thank you for inviting me, I guess Jim in particular, and others of you who are involved. And I thank all of you for coming out this evening. As Jim indicated, in this particular series, Scientia has been examining the theme of conflict, violence, and war. I should say it's wonderful to be here giving the Bachner lecture on the first year of its maturity, its 22nd year, and I am honored to be here. In addressing the theme of conflict, violence, and war, I'll focus on a myriad of local conflicts that have come to constitute a global challenge, both for the developed world and for the developing world. To respond to this challenge effectively, we have to understand the ways in which these local conflicts break with the pattern of war that we have come to take for granted for the last 300 years, at least, of modern Western history, roughly from the middle of the 17th century, at least to the middle of the 20th century. So I'd like to say a few words about that pattern and about the ways in which these local conflicts that bedevil our world today break with that pattern. The pattern has prevailed, just to have the illusion of precision, since 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. Those of you who know Western European history know that the Peace of Westphalia marked the end of what was called the 30 Years' War, or the Wars of Religion. It marked the demise, on this day when a new pope was named, it's worth reminding ourselves, it marked the demise of the Holy Roman Empire and the ascendance of history dominated by nation states and by conflicts that involve nation states. In this pattern, beginning in the middle of the 17th century, wars were fought between nation states or alliances of nation states. There were exceptions. The American Civil War is a notable exception, but on the whole, for 300 years, wars were between nation states. That's one feature. Secondly, wars, the duration of these wars was measured in years rather than in decades, as in the case of the 30 Years' War. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, during this period, a set of conventions arose that attempted to target casualties on combatants rather than on civilians. Those conventions had many rubrics, the most elaborated of which were the Geneva Convention. Certainly they were violated, if we think conspicuously at the end of World War II, the bombing of London and Berlin, the carpet bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, maybe most egregiously of all, the Holocaust as a whole. But nonetheless, those were breaks with conventions that were widely accepted, namely war ought to be conducted in a way that minimizes collateral damage and focuses casualties on combatants themselves. On each of these three features, the new face of war that I'm describing breaks with that pattern. First of all, rather than conflicts between nation states or alliances of nation states, the conflicts are, for the most part, within nominally unified states. Secondly, they're again measured in decades rather than in years. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, the ratio of civilian casualties to military casualties is inverted. As high a fraction as 90% of the casualties of these wars are civilians, perhaps no more than 10% are combatants. When this new face of war, this new pattern began, we could quibble about, certainly in the latter part of the 20th century. Those of us who like symmetries could say that the serial conflicts that lasted just about 30 years, the serial conflicts in Vietnam marked the bookend that ends the modern period of warfare, just as the 30 Years' War began it. If we want to see this new face of war, we can look at Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, or a host of other such localized conflicts that have major ripple effects that I argue constitute a global challenge. Among the horrors that are inescapable in this new face of war are enormous numbers of uprooted individuals, families, whole communities. There are now 35 million such people in the world. Nancy is a very good corrective to my illusion that for most people numbers are concrete. I do find them concrete rather than abstractions, but I think Nancy speaks for most people when she says that they're just abstractions. And so 35 million people, if you want to picture that somewhat more concretely, think of the metropolitan area populations of Boston, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, and Atlanta, all put together. You have roughly the scale of 35 million displaced people. These people figure very prominently in our sense of dislocation in the modern world. Think of throngs of people fleeing places of conflict, clutching their belongings, or long lines of supplicants waiting for water, or food, or shelter, or application papers, or circles of families that rejoice when they're reunited after having been separated. That's the face of the displaced people produced by this new face of war. The challenge is to find durable solutions for those people as they struggle to restart their lives. The organization that I work with, the International Rescue Committee, is focused on this challenge. So I invite you to look at this set of issues from the perspective of our activities worldwide. But first, maybe a couple of words about the International Rescue Committee, which I'm sure you all know about intimately, but I have discovered in the last 3 years that, in fact, a great many people don't know much about the International Rescue Committee. So, a few words about our history. The IRC was founded in 1933, as we like to say, at the suggestion of Albert Einstein, who thought it would be very helpful to have a committee of people located both in New York City and in port cities in Europe who would help refugees to flee Nazi-occupied Europe, not just Germany, but also one of the major ports of egress was Marseille, where Varian Fry, one of our earliest employees, forged documents, walked people over the Pyrenees, out through the harbor in order for them to be able to resettle in the United States. And then we had an office in New York that in fact helped these people get back on their feet. We continue that work of resettling refugees in this country. We have 22 offices across the United States. The closest ones to Houston are in Dallas, in Phoenix. Oh, in Abilene we have a new small office. Very good place to resettle refugees, I should say. The cost of housing is low, employment opportunities are substantial. So if you want to volunteer, you only have to go as far as Abilene or Dallas, and you can help us out. We, each year, continue to resettle thousands of refugees in this country. The employees in our resettlement offices are almost all former refugees. So they are expert at dispensing the kind of tough love required to get people back on their feet in short order. And virtually all of these refugees who are admitted within 6 months are employed, either know English or are learning English. Kids are in the schools, and they're pretty much on their own, although we stay in touch with them for 3 or 4 years to help out as needed. I have to say it's exhilarating work. I've visited all of our resettlement offices, and it's wonderful to see how people who lost everything are able very quickly to rebuild their lives, and how our society is able to incorporate them and help them to become productive citizens. But the numbers, again, I apologize for those of you who think numbers are abstract, but listen up. I'll try to make them as clear as I can. Before 9/11, the ceiling that the State Department, or the President set on the recommendation of the State Department, for the number of refugees allowed to be admitted to the United States was 70,000. After 9/11, it dropped precipitously to 25,000 and gradually has built back up. But even when it's back to 70,000 refugees resettled in the United States, 35 million displaced people around the world. That means 2 out of every 1,000 displaced people in the world have any prospect of being resettled in the United States, even if that's what they wanted, which is not at all clear. Most of them would prefer to go back home. But that leaves, in any case, 998 out of every 1,000 who have no prospect of winding up in this country. Very few of them have the prospect of winding up in another developed country. It means that we need to work in order to find durable solutions for them in some way other than resettling them in this country. Now, the IRC is working on all sides of this challenge. We're involved in 25 countries around the world for the simple reason that that's where the displaced people are. They are not among the small number that can be resettled in this country. I won't tell you about all 25 of those countries, but I thought I would take one to illustrate the multiple ways in which we work to address this problem of displaced people, a problem that has its origins locally but becomes a very important challenge for the world society as a whole. The example I'll use is Afghanistan. The International Rescue Committee has been involved with Afghan refugees for 25 years, since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan produced large numbers of refugees. During that 25-year period, we have resettled just about 7,000 Afghans in this country. And they're stellar citizens, almost all very successful. If you ever go to an Afghan restaurant, chances are it's being run by a family that was resettled here, having fled from Afghanistan. And so that's a very important part of what we do. But we resettled 7,000 refugees, the IRC, I don't mean the United States as a whole, had settled marginally more. But we resettled 7,000 refugees in this country. At the height of the refugee exodus from Afghanistan, there were 6 million Afghans in refugee settings abroad, almost all in Pakistan and Iran, although a few got to the United States and to other countries. So we work on other sides of this question as well. We have worked actively in Pakistan for all of those 25 years. We focus on schools and on health care. We run dozens of clinics and schools, have run those for 25 years. Many of those refugees whom we've worked with in exile will return and become leaders in the new Afghanistan. In fact, many have already returned. But they won't all return. Pakistan has not yet accepted the fact that substantial numbers of the remaining several million still in Pakistan are going to wind up staying. They're very well integrated into the Pakistani society. In fact, the communities with whom we've worked have better health care and better education than the local population. So the steps we're taking is to open up the clinics and schools that we have to the local population so that they will be more fully incorporated into that larger society. But many, in fact, do go back and are becoming leaders in the new Afghanistan. So we've also, during this period, been working in Afghanistan. Not quite the whole time, but the last 18 years, all through the Taliban period, for example. We were active in multiple sites across Afghanistan. And there we do what we always do. We work with people who've been displaced or refugees who are returning. We are, I think I'm not overclaiming to say we're the best in the business, the best in the world in developing water systems and sanitation systems and helping people get reestablished in homes and get their livelihoods reestablished. And I must say it's very exciting to go back to Afghanistan, as I've done now several times, and to have people come out and talk about how fabulously important it was that they were educated in IRC schools, or to point to an orchard and say, you know, that apple orchard, those seedlings were given to us by the IRC 12, 14, 15 years ago, or to point to large growing stands of poplars that are used as ceiling beams in the mud brick houses that Afghans build and say, those saplings, those seedlings came originally from the IRC. So there are people back in Afghanistan who are playing very important roles in leading that society. In particular, many of the returning refugees are teachers, people that we've educated in schools in Pakistan, in particular girls, now women, who were educated in Peshawar especially. And they go back, and in fact, the curriculum that we developed in our lead school in Peshawar now has become the model for all Dari-speaking curricula in Afghanistan. So there's a generation that's been prepared to assume leadership. One of the people who taught in our school in Peshawar when he was a refugee, an exile, is Hamid Karzai, who is now the president of Afghanistan, and delighted in telling me that he worked for the IRC when I met with him in Kabul, which I knew, but I was glad that he brought it up. And many of the other leaders in the new Afghanistan also were educated and given health care and other assistance while they were refugees in Pakistan. Let me mention one program that summarizes the initiatives that we're taking. It's called the National Solidarity Program. It's funded by the World Bank. We have two connections to it that are very important. First of all, it's modeled on a program that the IRC developed in Rwanda. And so we sent a team of our Rwandan staff to Afghanistan in order to help to design this program. And the way the program, it's run out of the Ministry for Rural Development, whose minister is a man named Hanif Atmar, who used to be an IRC employee. And it is designed to build from the village level to identify priorities that then will be funded by the World Bank, but to fund priorities identified at the village level and then worked up through all of layers of government to the ministry in Kabul itself. We're involved in 600 villages where this process is going on. It is, I think, extremely successful in helping to diversify and spread the reach of the government in Kabul and to develop a kind of civic society that did not exist there before. Let me make one last comment about Afghanistan. It illustrates the strategy we have in all of the places we're involved. Our strategy is to go with as small a number of outsiders, of international staff, as we need at the outside of an emergency. Some of them are American. Usually they're from other parts of the world, often from other third world countries. So they're not all from either Europe or the United States. So we now have in Afghanistan 30 international staff, what we call expatriates. They in turn work with 675 Afghan staff who are on our payroll. And they do a lot. They design water systems. They develop sanitation systems. They do the hiring of local people to implement systems that we set up. So that's 30 expatriates, 675 Afghan staff. They in turn work with another roughly 1,500 Afghans who are employed by non-government organizations indigenous to Afghanistan that we have brought along during the 25 years that we've been involved. So that's a ratio of 70 Afghans for every outsider. And that's the kind of human capital that's been developed that will continue to be there when we leave, which we will do, although we think we still have some substantial work we need to complete. Well, Afghanistan then illustrates the multiple ways in which we work on the problem of displacement, dislocation, beginning anew. We work to bring people to this country where that's feasible and where it's desired. We work with people in exile in order to be prepared to either become integrated into life in their new home or to return home ready to provide leadership in their home when it's possible to return. Now, I could adduce a distressingly large number of other illustrations where the same kind of multiple impacts are everyday experience. You'll, I think, be relieved that I'm not going to adduce a whole lot of other illustrations. But what I would like to do is to end, and it'll be a slightly longer ending than might be completely desirable, but end with three lessons that I think we have learned through the work that we do. And I'll illustrate the lessons by quickly referring to some of the other places where we work. The first lesson is that from the very beginning of an emergency intervention, usually occasioned by war and conflict, it is crucial to build capacity of the people in the communities that have been disrupted rather than to encourage dependence on outside assistance. That's an easy lesson to formulate. It's very difficult to adhere to in practice. Clearly, in the beginning of an emergency, when people will die if they don't get good water, if they don't have rehydration therapy, they'll die of diarrhea. They need to have emergency medical interventions. What we are always tempted to do, and what we do is emergency intervention. But we need to work very hard that not become a pattern of long-term dependence. Now, as I say, that's easier said than done. Let me give you examples, one example to show how excruciatingly difficult it can be, and then maybe a second example to show where it can be done well. The example that shows how difficult it is Darfur in Western Sudan. That crisis was ignited just when the major civil war within Sudan between the North and the South was moving toward a peace agreement. And it has been an absolutely vicious struggle in which bands of militia armed by the government in Khartoum, militia called the Janjaweed, which means the devil on horseback in Arabic, burned villages, kill any men that they can find, rape women as a weapon of war so that they're stigmatized, slaughter animals, pollute wells by putting carcasses into them so they can't be used again. There are now in Darfur alone. Darfur is the size of Texas, so this is only part of Sudan. Sudan as a whole is the size of Western Europe, just to get a scale of the country. There are now within Darfur 3 million displaced people, and there are 300,000 who've crossed the border into Chad. And we're working with the displaced people inside Sudan and also with displaced people across the border in Chad. And the IRC knows, because there are people there and everywhere else in the world are aware of the fact that I have a very firm view that we should not get involved in protracted refugee settings. And so we are very much attuned to wanting to get people back on their feet as soon as possible. The only fair solution for the Darfurians is for them to be able to go back to their villages and resume their farming that they were doing before. But clearly that is impractical until there is some minimum security, and the people who have already burned their village once and killed many of the males of their families and raped the women are brought under some kind of control. So we have, in spite of our best intentions, no alternative except to run refugee settlements, because there's no way of providing security unless people are brought into a more or less contained area where they can be protected when they go out to get firewood or when they go to get water. I guess I'm upsetting people. I'm sorry about that. So we will try very hard to get those Darfurians back into Western Sudan from across the border in Chad or from other places in Sudan where they've been displaced. But it is going to be very difficult to do, and there need to be a lot of political decisions and security decisions that are not yet in process before that will be possible. So let me give you an example where I think we have gotten it right. Aceh, the Aceh province in Indonesia. The IRC does not usually get involved in responding to natural disasters. We don't, because there are lots of other organizations that do that. There's an outpouring of human sympathy. There are usually plenty of resources. There are far fewer agencies that are able to deal with the kind of conflict situation that we deal with as a matter of course. But we were in Aceh because there's a civil war that's been going on there unfortunately, for 30 years. And so it would have seemed a little churlish to say, well, even though we have medical people and even though we could get response teams in here quickly, we're not going to do that because we don't do natural disasters. So we mounted a very quick response in Aceh. Aceh was the place that was the hardest hit when the tsunami hit. It was in direct path of the largest of the tsunami waves that hit the coast of Sumatra right in this province. We had emergency response teams there within 48 hours. We've done our usual, working very hard on getting potable water and sanitation. But we also have very quickly pivoted to getting people back on their feet. So most of the people who are displaced are farmers and fisher people. We've worked very hard at desalinizing wells and fields so that farming can begin again. And we've developed kits that allow the people to rebuild boats, which they are fully capable of doing, except that all of their power equipment, which they did use in the past, was destroyed by the tsunami. And so we're moving very quickly to get people back on their feet so they can take care of themselves rather than become dependent on us or on anyone else. That's what we should do. We can't always, but that's what we work for. So that's the first lesson. Second lesson is that sound governance is crucial. Let me refer as an example here to the Democratic Republic of Congo. You may know the DRC by its former name, Zaire, or by its still former name, the Belgian Congo. It has a horrifically bad history, going back to King Leopold II, the latter part of the 19th century, who was voracious in exploiting its natural resources. Then had the singular misfortune of having post-independence a series of really unconscionably bad rulers, including Mobutu Sese Seko. And from 1994 on was involved in what is often called the World War of Africa. 7 countries were involved, all of them allied with one or another parties within Congo, all of them eager to get their hands on those natural resources that tempted the Belgians. We've been involved in Congo since the time that war was at its peak. And it's an interesting example of how we can demonstrate how crucial it is to have sound governance. We did a series of what we call, in a macabre way, excess mortality surveys. That is to say, deaths above the expected baseline of what would have, the number of people who would have died if there had not been a war underway. And we've conducted surveys initially with the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, but then with other academic institutions. I think without question, no one has doubted the validity of the science, and the numbers are really horrific. The excess mortality by the end of our 4th survey is 3.8 million people. That makes it the most deadly war since World War II. Think about how traumatized this country was on 9/11. 3.8 million people is the equivalent in fatalities of 9/11 every day for 3.5 years. That's, again, makes the abstraction a little more concrete. Every day, 9/11 for 3.5 years. So that's the bad news. It's really very, very bad. And to give you a sense, I don't know, I hope many of you read the New York Times. If you don't, you should. As good as the Houston Chronicle is, it's not as good as the New York Times. This is the week in review, Sunday week in review for March 20th. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but this is a graphic. This is based entirely on the 4th of our surveys. This is one soldier, and for every soldier there are 62 other people who die. Remember my number about 9? This is a lot worse than 90-10. And then lots of interesting graphics. If you want to look at this later, I'll leave it up here. It's really it's an example of what a great newspaper can do if it puts its mind to it and it knows how to find accurate information. So the news is terrible. 3.8 million people dead, above what would be expected in what already is a place that has high mortality. But there's also good news. Beginning in 1998, there were peace negotiations, there was a peace signed. The UN has sent in one of its largest peacekeeping forces ever. Humanitarian assistance was able to get back into Eastern Congo. We actually were there all through this period, but many others weren't. And the result is that the slope of the line of excess mortality clearly, as security is reestablished, goes down markedly, which is not surprising when for every military casualty there are 62 civilian deaths. But it demonstrates very powerfully how crucial it is that there be a kind of government that can provide the kind of stability and security that we all take for granted. Now, this is a lesson that is especially important for us Americans to learn. bashing government, saying the less government the better, is kind of a hobby in the United States. And if anyone had been in as many places as I have in the last 3 years, where the problem is not too much government, but too little government, it becomes difficult to hear anti-government categorical statements without any recognition of how fundamentally important what we just take for granted and don't even notice, the fundamental security and stability that governments provide. So it's a lesson that we have to learn. Good governance, or at least decent governance, is crucial. The third lesson is that catastrophe prevention is far preferable to emergency intervention. That seems pretty straightforward. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, et cetera, et cetera. It is extraordinary how we manage to forget that lesson again and again and again. If we hadn't abandoned Afghanistan in the late 80s, we wouldn't have had the problems we had to deal with in the beginning of the 21st century. How do we do prevention? Well, there's no simple strategy. There are lots of interlocking steps. Let me mention two that I think are important. The first is we need to move in the area of trade so that trade becomes a plus for the impoverished as well as the well-to-do. Again, this has been widely recognized. The last major trade round that was negotiated, the Uruguay round in 1994, laid out a straightforward deal. The developed world, the rich world, would cut its subsidies of agricultural production, and the developing world would reduce tariffs on imports. The developing world, the poor countries, kept their part of the deal. Tariffs now are about half of what they were in 1994, on average, on products that are imported from the rich countries, from the developed world. And the rich countries simply reneged on the deal. There's been no reduction in subsidies. They're just about the same level now that they were in 1994. Just to give you a sense of the scale of that, the total development assistance provided worldwide by all of the rich countries is about 1/3 as much as what is provided in subsidies to agricultural production that basically drives farmers in poor countries out of business. Probably the most egregious case, which happily the World Trade Organization found against the U.S., is the subsidies of American cotton farmers, which are so enormous they make it completely uneconomic for West Africa to produce cotton, even though they have ideal conditions for it, have better quality cotton, but they simply can't compete against the very low prices of cotton once it's been subsidized and exported from the United States. So one step we have to take, and you'll hear a lot about this, the Doha round is underway, so it's important to be aware of how crucial it is that we have a fair set of trade arrangements that don't discriminate against the have-nots. Secondly, and I'm very aware that this second example does not receive a fond embrace anywhere in this country, but I expect that Texas may be even less hospitable to it than many places. But it nonetheless is the simple truth. We must substantially increase foreign assistance that is given to the developing world. Assistance in particular in areas of health and education, agricultural development. It's not that we don't know what works, it's that we are not putting any money into it. The developed countries at the World Food Summit in 1996 committed to providing, as a target by 2015, 0.7%, not 7%, but 0.7, 0.7% of gross domestic product for foreign assistance. The OECD, the Office of Economic Cooperation and Development, gathers data every year on how countries are doing on this matter. They gather data on the 22 most prosperous countries. Some countries are doing very well. 4 have surpassed the 0.7% target. In fact, in some cases, they've gone up to 1%, so it's 0.3 above the 0.7% target. And those are, I guess it's 5. It's Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So, not too surprising for those of us who follow stories on foreign assistance. That's not surprising. What is surprising is who is number 22 of 22, and that's the United States. We are at the rock bottom of all of the developed countries. And I think it's important for us to stop and think about that. At least I find it important to stop and think about it. I guess I just took this microphone off. I think it's important for us to think about it because we all know that the polls tell us that we're the most generous country in the world. And it's just not true. I've thought a lot about it because it seemed to me that to have this level of, well, it depends. Jim would say cognitive dissonance. I would say self-deception, collective self-deception. There have to be explanations. And then there are two considerations, I think, that help to explain why we are so deceived about the level of our generosity. The first is that I think it probably is demonstrable that Americans are the most generous people in the world in terms of private philanthropy. We are very skeptical about government, but we are generous. It has to do with the Anglo-Saxon traditions. It has to do with tax incentives. It has to do with traditions of all sorts. But we are generous. And as I will indicate when I get back to those abstract numbers, it does make a difference, some difference, not very much. But it's one consideration that helps to explain why we think we're the most generous. The second consideration is even more dramatic, it seems to me, and that is that we used to, in fact, be much more generous. In 1948, it's not a year I picked by accident, but nonetheless, at the height of the Marshall Plan, 18% of the federal budget, 18% was in foreign assistance, rebuilding two countries, for the most part, that we had defeated in World War II. But 18%, that's an astonishing high percentage. It's about the percentage when Americans are polled and say how much of the federal government goes to foreign assistance, they say things like 10, 15, 20, 25%. So they're not completely crazy, they're just 50 years or 55 years out of date. Now, if you translate that back into the percentage of GDP, it's about 4.2%. So 6 times as high as the target we're setting now in 1948. Now, by the 60s, that had eroded to about 0.6%. So it eroded by a factor of 7. But still within striking distance of 0.7%. Now the number stands at 0.15%. So, about a fifth of what the target is. Again, try to make it a little less abstract. Think of the gross domestic product of this country or any country as a $100 bill. Then Denmark, the highest giver, out of the $100 gives $1. And the United States gives a dime and a nickel, 15 cents. Now, we add in all the private contributions, what churches give internationally, foundations, corporations, add it all together, and maybe you get another dime. So, and that's costing it out generously. So then we're at 25 cents out of every, not out of $1, not out of $10, out of $100, 25 cents. Now we can do better than that, and we need to do better than that if we're going to live up to our own best sense of ourselves as Americans and our own best performance in the past. Our closest ally, sometimes our only ally, Great Britain, has made it. Britain has not been as stingy as the United States in recent years, but it certainly hasn't been among the leaders. It's been kind of in the middle of the pack. And Tony Blair has made it a priority that by 2008, Great Britain will be at 0.7%. And that means very aggressively moving up, because they're now at about 0.3, about double the US, but still way off the target. So if they get to 0.7%, Great Britain, the little island of Great Britain, will be giving as much as the United States, despite the enormously different ratio of the different base of their own gross domestic product. I don't know if you've probably seen in the last week or so, France and Germany now also have committed that in the next 5 years or so they will move up to 0.7%. The only country that really hasn't been heard from on this matter is the United States. I want to be very clear, this is not a partisan comment. The Bush administration has done significantly better than the Clinton administration. It has, in fact, under the Clinton administration, it wouldn't be a dime and a nickel, it was a dime. So the Bush administration has moved up significantly, partly with HIV funding, partly with the Millennium Child's Account. These haven't all yet been fully funded, but I think it's clear the Bush administration is trying to move in the right direction on these issues. It's just thinking in terms that are far too small for the magnitude of the problem. Well, let me summarize the 3 lessons then. I'm sorry that did take me longer. What's one of the problems if you were an academic? From the beginning, we have to build capacity rather than encouraging dependence. Sound government is crucial. And thirdly, catastrophe prevention is much preferable to emergency intervention. Now, the International Rescue Committee works hard every day on implementing these lessons. We've got a dedicated staff, 9,000 people worldwide, over 95% of them citizens of the countries where we work. We are extremely disciplined in how we do it. 90% of every dollar that we deploy goes for programs, only 10% for administration, including fundraising, executive salaries, the rest of it. Our budget is about last year was $160 million. This year will be about $180 million. And it's the way that budget is configured is really crucial. 15% of it is private money raised from individuals, for the most part, sometimes foundations, to a much lesser extent corporations, but non-government funding. And that means that we can set our own priorities. We decide where to go, we decide what the priorities are, we decide where the needs are greatest and where we can make the most difference in meeting them. And then we leverage every private dollar we have with another $6 from the US government, from the UN, European Community, DFID, the British Development Organization, Scandinavian countries, and so on. So we have a very diverse portfolio of funds from other sources. The UN and the US government are the 2 largest, but others are also very substantial. And the key, though, is the private money that we get because it lets us set our own agenda. Now, of course, I'd be delighted to talk with any of you who want to help us meet that very important target of private money, but I'll also be able or willing and happy to talk about any other issues, and therefore I'd welcome your questions and your comments.
If you'll take a moment to look underneath your seats, you'll find pledge envelopes. Yes, we are locking the doors. But I would encourage you to check out the IRC. If you Google them, you can find their website. The ways in which you can donate directly to the IRC are spelled out clearly there, and I'd encourage you to consider doing that if you have been for George tonight. So what we'd like to do now, Chuck and I would like to find hands that are going up, and we will ask you to wait until you've got a microphone and verify that the microphone is in fact on. Seems to be.
Thank you. I'm a little puzzled as to your philosophical stance. On the one hand, you make a point that it's important to get families off of relief, into independence, into sort of self-sustaining mode, so to speak. And yet, you made a very strong plea for more foreign aid, accusing the United States of stinginess and so forth. Yet many people would argue that foreign aid puts countries on welfare and is against the idea of independence at the country level. So how would you recognize what appears to me to be something of a cognitive dissonance, perhaps, in your talk?
Well, I think it's a very apt observation, and it is, let me first assure you that you did hear correctly on both sides, so that it's not a matter that you misheard. I think it is very important to focus on getting people to be able to stand on their own feet and support themselves. I also think that there develops a level of dysfunctionality in a country, or in the case of conflict situations, victimization of people through no fault of their own, who lose everything and who are extremely vulnerable to disease and to violence. And the key is to reestablish a level of stability and resource base that allows people to take care of themselves. And that simply does not happen by itself. And so I don't think there's any contradiction between having interventions that are targeted on getting people on their feet, but nonetheless are interventions to provide assistance to people who have been victimized by long extended conflicts over which they have neither control for which they did not have responsibility. So I think those are reconcilable, but we can pursue that further if you'd like.
Well, it's a long, complicated topic. Maybe other people would rather ask questions.
Let's take one from the other side and then go to Michael Carroll. Perhaps we'll come back.
Well, Steve, give us some polling data.
George, I want to ask you, do you have a sense that, in fact, there is more willingness today than perhaps any time in many years for the developed countries to really step up to the plate, that maybe there's a possibility of reducing poverty on this planet in the next, the goal is to reduce by half the amount of poverty by in the next 30 years? I mean, do you see this as, do you see a coming together of forces and ideas and understandings that may be new in our time?
Well, I guess I wouldn't put it quite that optimistically, but I do think that there is a special opportunity now for a couple of reasons. First of all, the developed world did sign on to this goal of 0.7%. It isn't something that I'm saying and they should sign on. They embraced it and are simply not living up to it. Secondly, I think that Tony Blair really is firmly committed to this as a major priority, and he happens to be head of the European community, which is a rotating position at a time when he is really going to push hard on that, and I think that's one reason that both France and Germany have also stepped up to the plate. Thirdly, I do think that President Bush honestly does want to increase funding, and he's very, very conscious about targeting it on countries that meet minimum thresholds of decent governance and lack of corruption and so on, which I think is all to the good. The real problem is that the steps have been so tepid. I mean, I'm not making these numbers up. 15 cents out of $100 it's not as if we couldn't afford, even $1 out of $100 if we went as far as the Danes and the Norwegians and the Swedes. I think the first crucial step is for people to understand how little we do. And it is just flabbergasting how difficult it is for Americans to accept the fact that we do as little as we do, even though it's a matter of arithmetic. And I must say, the 15 cents counts money that I personally would not count. I mean, I'm just using the public data, but it's not as if the money that we give to Egypt because they signed a peace agreement with Israel is really development assistance. But that's all included in this 15 cents. If you stripped out the money that's given for bilateral foreign aid, foreign policy reasons, we'd be down to sort of maybe 6-7 cents on $100. So I'm sounding less sanguine than you gave me the opportunity to sound. But I think there's a confluence of events, and it's very important that those of us who understand these issues work through the political process and also the electoral process to make the point that there is an opportunity to do something. I don't think any of us is pleased about the fact that there are, 3 billion people in the world living on less than $2 a day. Look, if you take the 44% of the population of the world, 44% that lives on $2 a day or less, that's 44%. They get a minuscule fraction of the global domestic product. And if you take the less than 1 billion, 950 million or so people from the wealthiest countries, we consume a very large fraction. I mean, that's 15% of the population consumes 80%, 81% of the world's wealth. So if we consumed 80% instead of 81%, I mean, not an enormous change. That would make a tremendous difference for the 44% of the population that is consuming almost none of it. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Who's got
George,
microphones?
a comment and a question. My comment is I'm still recovering from my surprise. I thought your thoughts on war, conflict, and violence would be reflections on your time at Columbia. The question, I think what you said about the difference between modern conflicts and pre-Vietnam, and then leading to your three questions, and particularly the third one, I'm wondering if you can see a qualitative difference in the causes of conflicts, pre- and post-Vietnam. And in particular, I'm puzzled. I think the discrepancy between consumption by the haves and the have-nots, the highly developed and underdeveloped nations, is one of the driving forces. But it's not clear why that should lead to internal conflict rather than conflicts between nations.
Well, that is the first one is an easy one to comment on, namely that of course my comments on war and conflict could have reflected my experience at Columbia, but I thought this might be more interesting. The causes, Scientia has been looking at war and conflict now through this whole series, and I trust will have taken some trouble to look at the various and sundry causes. I'm very reluctant to speculate, across this whole range of conflicts, but I don't think it is, in the first instance, because of the disparity between the well-to-do countries and the impoverished countries. I think it's rather within impoverished countries, there is a very powerful competition for the scarce resources that there are. Or in those impoverished countries that have great natural resources, there's competition for control of the natural resources. So they are many of these countries that are now nominally unified are artificial creations of historical developments in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, largely under the impact of colonialism. And so they don't necessarily make any sense, and yet there's no way of moving out of those because it's going to create even more problems to sort of define new boundaries for these countries. So there's a lot of built-in internal conflicts. And I really do believe that the crucial achievement, more important even than water and sanitation in many of these countries, is to get a minimally effective government for assuring security of the population. And that is very difficult to achieve. We see now the difficulty that the AU has, the African Union troops have in doing it, and even just in Darfur, not to mention the whole of Sudan. But I think that's critically important. So I would place a larger causative role on that kind of internal instability than on the affluent versus poor divide. I think the contrast between the rich and the poor countries is a scandal from the point of view of how little we in the developed world are prepared to do about it. But I don't think in but the most indirect way it's the cause of these internal conflicts.
How do you understand the differences in the levels of giving between the different countries, especially between, say, the Danes and Norwegians and the United States? What motivates or produces that level of difference?
Well, I think again, here it is important that what the OECD measures is official development assistance. And I think that the position of the Scandinavian countries is, one of the obligations of government is to take care of what in this country is often done through charitable giving. So the same would be true in terms of voluntary contributions to religious organizations. That's done through a state tax. And so I think there's an expectation that government will act on behalf of the populace as a whole. And I think there is quite strong support in Scandinavian countries for doing at least, their fair share in terms of development assistance for poorer countries. In the United States, there is a deep distrust of government and a suspicion that foreign assistance is, often futile and doesn't accomplish anything, and therefore a built-in excuse for not having the government step up to the plate. And yet the scale of what is committed to, if we take a target like 0.7% of GDP, is such that it cannot realistically be done through private agencies. And that means that we have a perfect excuse, but we don't have an alternative way of really stepping up to the plate. And so I guess that's where I would see the origin of the difference. The remarkable fact is the historical fact. After World War II, we did step up to the plate. We stepped up to the plate in a massive way, and that now is still staggering. I mean, if you think 18% of the government, of government expenditures, it's really remarkable. So it's not inconceivable that we can get to the point where we recognize a role of government in this area. But I think all of our traditions, voluntary association, separation of a strong private sector, starve the government beast, and so on, all count against doing it through government. And yet that's the only way we can scale up to the level that's required.
George, welcome back to Rice University.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Question is regarding students. Is there any room within IRC context for opportunities for students to go abroad and be part of such volunteer work? There seems to be an increasing sense of awareness among the students to go and help the deprived communities, whether refugees or those who do not have just the basic facilities.
Well, I think there are opportunities, but they're fairly constrained. And they're constrained because our priority is on recruiting and training citizens from the countries where we work. We do use outside, for example, when we went into Indonesia, we recruited doctors and nurses from Johns Hopkins, from Columbia, from Harvard on short-term stints because we needed to have quick emergency interventions. But they needed to be skilled people. There wasn't a space for just volunteers who would try to sort of help out. And interestingly, in these emergency response teams, we also sent staff from our other country programs. So one of the great delights I had in Aceh was going to a remote fishing village where everything had been wiped completely. The tsunami had just flattened every house for 2 kilometers in from the coast, and we'd gotten people there by boat. And had already set up, water and sanitation systems by the time I got there. And one of our staff members came running up to me and said, "I bet you never expected to see me here." And his name was Akbar John, and I had last seen him in Afghanistan. And he'd worked with the IRC for 15 years in Afghanistan. He's an engineer, designed the water system that was put into this place. And he was so proud and happy. But he brought real skills to what he was able to do there. Now, we do have space for, we're working with Hopkins and Columbia to see if in their schools of public health we can have a regular rotation, whereas part of the internship they take as part in the public health sequence will be 3 months or 6 months in one of our operations. So students at that level we think we can incorporate. We also have one program that I mentioned to a couple of you earlier today that Rice could do worse than emulate. It's called Princeton in Africa. It's by Princeton alums who have raised resources in order to allow Princeton just graduated students to go to Africa working with NGOs. We've been with this program from the beginning, and they have about a dozen fellows who are placed each year. and we get about 40% of them. I mean, because we love them. They're smart. They know how to write. They can be helpful in lots of ways, and they have very good experiences. And they tell the other students about it. So we always get a bumper crop the following year. Now that's something where we split the cost. Princeton covers some of it. We cover actually most of it because we put them on grants because they're very able young people. So that's an example where, but they come and they work as paid professionals. They're not volunteers. We can't do much with volunteers in the third world countries where we work. We have a lot of volunteers in our resettlement offices, but not in our international programs.
Over the last several years, there's been a lot in the news about the orphans who have resulted from the wars in Africa and the AIDS epidemic all over the world. And it sort of gives you the impression that there are millions of orphaned children out there in the streets with no supervision, no education, no, families. And if this is true, when these children grow up, if they don't have anything better that comes along, they're going to be a real problem for world peace, I suppose. Can you comment? Do you know what's going on?
Yeah, I think that's all true, and there certainly are millions of orphans in Africa alone because of the tremendous toll that HIV/AIDS in particular is taking of parents. Now, they may not grow up to be real problems because they may not grow up. I mean, they may just die, but it is a very large problem. And so the question about whether or not foreign assistance is, forcing people into dependence. These kids really do not, they're not responsible for the state that they're in, and they are unlikely to be able to live productive lives unless there's some intervention that gives them both education and health care early on. And that seems to me not to compromise the potential for them to attain long-term independence because it's really the only possibility. And that's, again, the way I guess I would find the balance between insisting that people stand on their own 2 feet, but giving them assistance to get to that point. But there are a great many orphans and larger numbers every day in Africa.
Well, thanks to Scientia's executive assistant, Ellen Butler, we have food and drink awaiting us outside in the foyer. So on behalf of all of Scientia, thank you for a wonderful year. Thank you for coming tonight. And let's put our hands together for George Rupp for a wonderful Bachner lecture.
Did you see this?
I didn't see it.